Hi everyone, my name is Seoyoung Hwang, and today I'll be exploring the significance of the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887 and its impact on the lives of Native Americans in the United States. First, for those who may not be familiar with this topic, the Dawes Act of 1887 was passed by the federal government to legally seize the tribal lands of Native Americans. The act was passed to guide Native Americans away from their tribes and to assimilate them into the American society. The Dawes Act designated 160 acres of farmland, or 320 acres of grazing land, to the Native Americans who accepted the element from the government and followed the assimilation policies. I'll be answering these following research questions in this presentation. To what extent did the United States government benefit from the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887? How did the Dawes Severalty Act impact the Native Americans that resisted the element? Why did the Native Americans that chose assimilation still face challenges within the American society? Through the Dawes Act, the United States government was able to obtain over 90 million acres of land that were seized from the Native Americans by outlying tribal ownership. Before the late 1800s, the Native American reservations equaled about 138 million acres. By the end of the element period, their landholdings had been reduced to about 47 million acres, approximately one-third of its original size. Although the government had implied that the seized tribal lands were to be divided and to be given to the Native Americans, however, over 80 million acres of tribal land was sold off to non-Native Americans. This paragraph is directly quoted from the Section 8 of the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, which promises these following Native tribes that they will not be included in the Dawes Act and that their tribal lands will not be taken away by the government. This comparison here, the map on the left is the Indian Territory of Oklahoma in 1885 before the Dawes Act, and the map on the right is the Native American Territory in Oklahoma in 1891. Although it may look like the map on the right is bigger, if you look closely, the right is only about one-third the size of the left map. The Indian Territory in Oklahoma were the lands of Native American tribes, including the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminoles. If we look back at the Section 8 of the Dawes Act, it says, "The provisions of this act shall not extend to the territory occupied by the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles." In 1898, the United States government passed the Curtis Act, which included the Native American tribes that were initially excluded from the Dawes Act. This map shows the comparison of before the Dawes Act and the Curtis Act and after. So this territory was owned by the Sioux Band, which was one of the biggest Native American tribes in North America. But just from the Black Hills Territory, 7.3 million acres were taken away from the Sioux. And if you see here, most of the land in Wyoming, Montana, Nebraska, and North Dakota are taken away from the Sioux. This map shows the indigenous tribes that lived in Colorado because they were not affected by the Dawes Act of 1887 until the passing of the Hunter Act in 1895 to drive these Native American tribes off from the Southern Ute Reservation. Despite the objection of President Grover Cleveland, the act was passed to provide the pioneers with thousands of acres of the Colorado's best farming land. Most of the Native American bands in Colorado ended up accepting the element, and the only tribe that resisted was the Weminuche tribe led by Ignacio. They were the only tribe in the Southern Ute Reservation to resist and were eventually forced off to the low ends of the sleeping Ute Mountain. The Mauche and the Capote tribes had initially rejected the allotment at first, but was persuaded to receive the element by Sapia, also known as the Buckskin Charlie. This picture is Sapia in 1890 after he was awarded the Rutherford Hayes Indian Peace Medal by President Benjamin Harrison for persuading many Native American bands in Colorado to accept the element. Many Native American tribes that lost their territory to the United States government were compelled to receive alignment through the Dawes Act because they were no longer able to farm, hunt, or practice their normal ways of tribal life. They also feared the violent oppression by the American military towards the Native Americans that resisted the alignment. On December 29, 1890, 146 Sioux Native American women and children were killed at the Wounded Knee Massacre. This was an example of violence towards Native Americans that resisted assimilation. Tensions between the Sioux tribe and the American government was especially high before the massacre because of the ghost dance spiritual movement that was danced by the Sioux tribe to resist against the American policies. This map shows the number of Native American boarding schools that were established by the government by 1892. There were about 25 Native American boarding schools across all of the United States. Children from over 300 different Native tribes that spoke over 200 different languages were lumped together despite the differences in language and culture in the boarding schools. This made it very difficult for teachers to negotiate complex linguistic and historical tensions between the different students in the classroom. Due to the only English policy and lack of proper funding from the government, the children were not given proper education at the boarding schools. This image here is Anne Ruggles Gear, a former Native instructor at Carousel Indian Industrial School, and other female Native instructors. Gear traces back to the discrimination against Native instructors in the boarding schools, as well as being given less pay and less authority in the school compared to her Anglo counterparts. The Native teachers were painted as turncoats by the Native Americans while being seen as inferior by the American teachers. This image shows 3 men from the Sioux tribe dancing their traditional Sioux ghost dance. For many pioneers at the time, their only contact with Native Americans was through medium of performance, and for many Native Americans, their only way of representing themselves to Americans was through their traditional performances. Among all the Native Americans that received assimilation, only 15% of them were able to fluently speak English. The lack of basic communication and correspondence between the pioneers and Native Americans was a major blockade in the success of the Native American assimilation. For centuries, Native Americans have constantly experienced oppression and persecution under the American government. These oppressive policies, like the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, still has significant impact on the lives of Native Americans today. As shown in this figure, American Indians and Alaska Natives experience the highest rate of poverty in the United States. In April of 2020, researchers have found that during COVID, more than 1/4 of Native American workforce, approximately 26.3%, were unemployed. This was the highest rate amongst any racial group in the United States. It was also found that in the state of New Mexico, more than 30% of COVID-positive cases were by Native Americans, despite the fact that they were still a minority in the state. Although it is evident that the Dawes Act of 1887 had a tragic result for the Native Americans, when Henry Lawrence Dawes first proposed the idea, one of his intentions was to include the Native Americans in the American economics and American politics. In 1929, Charles Curtis became the first United States Vice President with a Native American ancestry. Then in 2018, Democrats Sheriff David and Deb Haaland became the first Native American woman elected to Congress. Then in 2021, Deb Haaland became the first Native American to serve as the U.S. Interior Secretary. While it is very important to understand and recognize the struggles and sufferings that the Native Americans experienced due to the Dawes Severalty Act of 1887, it is also notable to acknowledge the improvements in the United States for racial diversity and the inclusion of Native Americans in the American media and American politics.